The problems for Elvis Presley began in 1970. No one could have imagined that behind the perfectly black, thick, slightly wavy waterfall that invariably adorned the head of the king of rock and roll lay a deep, almost morbid anxiety. This hair was not just a part of his image. It was his crown, his shield, his nonverbal declaration of eternal youth and unparalleled masculine power. In fact, when in 1970, at the peak of his triumphant return to Las Vegas, Elvis saw on a newly shot film how the flashes of spotlights cruelly highlighted a barely noticeable, but for him, catastrophic, thinning at his temples, his heart squeezed with genuine horror. It was a shock, pure, unadulterated panic. Elvis Presley, an icon of beauty, could not allow himself to age, or even worse, go bald. At that moment, standing in front of the mirror in his dressing room, he made a decision that was to remain the deepest, dirtiest secret of his life. No one was to know that the king had a vulnerability, that his beauty required a surgical underground. His doctor, respected but pliable to influence and money, received an unambiguous order to find a solution, the most modern, the most discreet, that existed in the world. The operation was not just to take place secretly. It was to take place absolutely non-existent, off the official records, as if it had never been. And so, in a cold, almost laboratory basement of an elite Los Angeles clinic, far from the spotlight, the development of the Tupelo plan began. His final, most important performance against the relentless passage of time. Chapter 1. A Shadow on the Temples. The world saw Elvis in glittering, jewel-encrusted jumpsuits, radiating energy and sexuality. But behind the scenes, in the private wing of Graceland, a different atmosphere reigned. His obsession with his hair bordered on the absurd. There were over 20 different styling products in his bathroom, and his hairdresser, Larry Geller, was not just a stylist, but the guardian of his most valuable asset. Geller, unlike most of the entourage, knew about the problem. He fought it daily. Special dyes to darken the scalp, intricate backcombing techniques to hide the receding hairline on his forehead. But Elvis constantly demanded a teenager's line. Thick, low set. In 1971, the problem intensified. Excessive use of dyes, frequent diet changes, and stress took their toll. The hair became thinner. Elvis could spend an hour studying his part under different lighting. He began demanding that his guards check if a strong wind was blowing before he got out of the car. This fear was ruinous. When the hair goes, the king goes, he whispered to Geller once. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, was only initiated into this military secret because of the financial aspect. The operation was to cost a crazy amount of money, $50,000, which at the time was simply an astronomical sum for such a procedure. But Parker understood, the king is a brand, and the king's brand cannot have holes in the crown. Whoever is subscribed to the channel has probably seen how Tom Parker used Elvis for his secret purposes. In the following stories, I will reveal new secrets of this cardinal. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss new videos. Chapter 2. Protocol Frontline. The specialist found for this top-secret mission was Dr. Leopold Kramer, a brilliant but financially compromised dermatologist from Beverly Hills. Kramer practiced one of the newest, least invasive techniques of the time, the so-called punch graft method. This was before the advent of modern FUE or FUT, but it was surgery. Operation details, fictional. Date, April 14th, 1972, Wednesday. Location, Kramer's private house in Malibu, converted into a clinic. It was safer than any hospital. Personnel, only DR. Kramer, his nurse, who signed a $1 million non-disclosure agreement and was to be immediately dismissed, and Elvis's personal bodyguard, Red West. Procedure. Elvis was given a strong but short-acting sedative. He feared general anesthesia, which could cloud his voice. The back of the head, the donor area, was shaved in small sections, concealed by the long hair that remained. Using a special 1mm surgical punch, the transplant instrument of the time, Kramer made tiny holes in the back of the head and extracted cylindrical columns of skin, each containing 2 to 4 hair follicles. It was a very painful and bloody procedure, even under local anesthesia. Implantation. These tiny flaps of follicles were then implanted into pre-prepared micro-incisions on the temporal and frontal parts of the head. It took Kramer 5 hours to transplant about 400 micrografts. By today's standards, very few, but it was the maximum allowed by the technique of the time to avoid obvious scars. When Elvis woke up, he was pale and exhausted. His head was tightly bandaged, but the first thing he did was carefully feel the bandaged area. Red West, the bodyguard, later recalled that the king cried, but they were not tears of pain, but tears of relief mixed with deep shame. Red, if anyone finds out, it's the end. Do you understand? The end. Chapter 3. The 2 weeks of fire. The next 2 weeks were hell. Elvis canceled all public appearances, citing an airborne flu. He lived in complete isolation in a rented house where there were only 2 windows without blinds. All mirrors were covered, except for one he used to examine his head under strong magnification. His face was swollen from the anesthesia. The newly transplanted flaps looked like tiny, red, bumpy doll's heads, as they were then called, protruding above the skin surface. It was a shocking sight. Elvis was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He constantly took painkillers and sleeping pills. His beloved doctor, Dr. George Nicopolos, Dr. Nick, didn't even know what these wounds were, as Kramer demanded complete exclusivity until healing. The biggest problem arose when the so-called shock loss began. The transplanted hair, and then some of the surrounding hair, temporarily fell out. Elvis, seeing this, fell into genuine hysteria. He threw furniture and screamed that he had been cheated, and now he looks like a plucked turkey. Only long, calming talks with Kramer, who promised that the hair would grow back stronger and thicker, were able to restrain him. To hide the traces, Elvis had to wear a thick wig, specially made by Larry Geller for the recovery period. He used it during some studio sessions and short outings. This wig, which was later noticed in some photos from 1972 to 1973, when the king had a somewhat unusual helmet-like appearance, became his cover. Chapter 4. The New Crown and the Sacrifice. 8 months later, the result became obvious. The new hair did indeed grow back. Not perfectly, but thick enough to cover the most problematic areas. The hairline was lower, thicker, though slightly coarser due to the technique of time. It was a triumph of obsession. No one in the world would notice this difference, as he was always seen from a distance. But the price was high. First, he became even more withdrawn and distrustful. He intensified control over his entourage, demanding that everyone swear that his hair is his own, given by God. Secondly, this operation became a trigger for the intensification of his dependence on medication. To cope with the pain, anxiety, and fear of exposure, he began demanding a constant supply of painkillers and sleeping pills from Dr. Nick. He reasoned, "If I can fool nature with hair, I can fool nature with sleep and pain." This very secret operation, according to some fictional biographers, became the catalyst for his final, tragic spiral of addiction. The shocking finale. One day, in early 1973, during a tour, Elvis and Red West were sitting in the dressing room. The king took off his famous jumpsuit and sat in front of the mirror. He pulled a small, silver box, locked with a combination lock, out of a cabinet. Red had never seen it before. Elvis opened it. Inside lay 3 tiny, discolored, but perfectly formed cylinders of skin with hair follicles. His own removed flaps. He carefully picked one up with his fingers. "You know, Red," he said, his voice barely audible, "these are my trophies. When I want to take my power, I just moved it. This is proof. Proof that I will always be the king. And no one, ever, will know the price I paid for this damned waterfall." He put the back in a box, closed the lock, and handed it to West. "Keep this. This is my legacy. The real legacy. This box, which contained the bloody evidence of his obsession with appearance and fear of aging, disappeared after his death. But those who knew kept the secret until the end of their lives, because they understood, for Elvis Presley, perfectly thick hair was not just a hairstyle, but his own man-made immortality. This is only the beginning. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about Elvis Presley and his secrets.